Hello and welcome everyone to NEDA Awareness Week, where everyone has a seat at the table. I'm Dianne Bondy, social justice activist, author, and yoga teacher, and today I'm the moderator for Black Mental Health Matters, Eating Disorders, and the Black Community Roundtable discussion. I have the honor to introduce the esteemed panelists for today's discussion, Mimi Cole, who is currently pursuing her master's degree to become a therapist. She is the host of the podcast, The Lovely Becoming. I love that so much, and is passionate about disordered eating and obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm also joined by Paula Edwards-Gayfield, the Regional Assistant Vice President at Renview Center, overseeing clinical and administrative operations in locations nationwide. Paula is also a certified eating disorder specialist and the co-chair of the African American Eating Disorder Professionals Committee. And last but certainly not least, Shana Spence is a registered dietitian nutritionist. Shana is self-described as eat anything. You're my friend on that. I love that. I started her career in fashion initially. Shana founded her passion in food policy and public health. I want to thank you all for joining me here today. This topic is so important to me, and I have to say I'm fangirling and I'm nervous a little bit because I'm going to tell you why. I battled or struggled with an eating disorder or disordered eating for about 25 to 30 years. And in my treatment and recovery, I never had the opportunity to have a clinician or a therapist that looked like me and could understand an eating disorder from the perspective of my lived experience or my culture. So seeing your faces here today makes me so excited that we can start to see that eating disorders or disordered eating affects everyone. So for a long time, I only saw college-age white women being represented as people who had eating disorders. So I wasn't diagnosed for a long time because Black folks or people of color didn't get eating disorders. And I'm here in Canada, where we work with NEDIC, which is the National Eating Disorders Information Center. And I went to their conference 2 years ago of about 700 clinicians. And out of those 700 clinicians, there were maybe 4 or 5 people of color. So I'm really, really excited to see this particular industry, this particular treatment center, this particular treatment modality have more faces of color, so representation can happen here. So I want to thank you for coming on this panel. I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing. I can't imagine what my experience of recovery would have been like had I sat across from somebody who looks like you. So I'm just a little emotional and excited for this conversation. So shall we get into it? Shall we jump in?
Yeah. Let's do it.
So after I've given my long diatribe as to why I think representation is important, maybe one of you can expand on that. Why is representation within this community for Black people or people of color, BIPOC people, important?
I don't know if anyone just wants to jump in. As talking, Dianne, so thank you for moderating and thank you for sharing your experience. I kept thinking, okay, we're done, even though I know we're not, but that sense of representation matters. And I think that kind of just sums it up. Like, again, I know it's a greater discussion, but that really is the point that just drives home for me. I was thinking about why does that matter? Because we know mental health exists, right? We know Black people struggle with mental health concerns. We know Black people struggle with eating disorders. And even though, like you said, years ago, it may not have been in the way that we thought it would have been or how it may have been communicated when you're looking at like our white counterparts, but it was still there and it was still present. And then it's being missed in terms of diagnosis. And so clearly, there's so many reasons that I know we don't have time to get into, but I think it just helps to reduce stigma. It helps to increase access to care. It helps to know that, if I go to treatment, even if the clinician, as much as we want a clinician or a dietitian to look like me, even if I know there are other people who look like me and people who understand a little bit or who are open to understanding my cultural experiences versus sort of putting me in this box of what an eating disorder looks like and presents with, I think that's what's so important, going back to representation matters. So, yeah.
Thank you, Paula, for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really matters because when we think about eating disorders and when we're thinking about who gets them, then that informs who we're looking for in our practice. And so it really helps to be able to name and recognize those in people of color when we know what we're looking for and when we're not ignoring the schemas that we've built. And so what that means is basically, if you think of someone who has an eating disorder, you're usually thinking emaciated, young, white, and you're really missing a lot of the broad spectrum of most people with eating disorders. And then they go undiagnosed, and then they go untreated, and then the length of the eating disorder continues.
Yeah.
I share, I think everyone's sentiments right here. And Dianne, I feel like your story is very close to my story as well. So I was so happy that you shared that in the beginning, just because I went through my own bout, with disordered eating, and I didn't even know what that was until recently. And it kind of just triggered me, like, I didn't think that I had it because I wasn't white, I wasn't, super, super skinny. So what on earth, and it didn't hit me until recently. And also just coming from a dietitian's point of view, whenever my clients, particularly Black women, come to me, oftentimes I have to point out to them, have you ever thought about maybe also seeking a therapist for your eating disorder? And they kind of just look at me, I see it in their face because they still don't realize that they have maybe a history with eating disorders or disordered eating, and because we're not represented. So that's why I'm super excited to be here and have this conversation for sure.
A question
I just add, I'm
Sure.
sorry, Dianne.
Go ahead. Being online, we step on each other.
Thank you. Shana, thank you. Even knowing that you as a dietitian are also then still saying, have you thought about meeting with a therapist, and talking with a therapist, because I do think it's so important to also acknowledge the therapist may not be the first stop. Right, it may be the medical professional, it may be a dietitian, it may be someone else. And so just appreciating that that's a part of what your process is when you notice it. So thank you.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think it's just so important because I can definitely give resources and tools, but I think that there's so much to dig deeper on, and therapy helps for a number of reasons, of course, but definitely for something like eating disorders, especially when you don't realize that you may show signs of it or come to mind, I think it's especially important.
Right.
There's a couple of things that come up for me from this conversation right here is sometimes within the Black community, I'm of Caribbean descent, sometimes in the Black community, I find that there's a hesitation to seek out mental health awareness or to go and see a therapist. So sometimes, do you find that as a clinician, you are met with maybe a little resistance around seeking a therapist when that comes up?
For myself, yes, definitely. And it's, I'm still, if I'm completely honest, I'm still trying to figure out a way to say it without offending someone, even though I don't think it should offend anyone. I think everyone should see a therapist, but I know that stigma, and I know, depending on who I'm talking to, how it will be received. So I'm still working on that, but for sure, there's always that look of there's nothing wrong with me, or, it's, there's always that look. And I try to tell them, explain there is nothing wrong with you, one, of course. But it would really help to, I'm talking to you now, giving you certain tools, but it would just help you so much to get a broader perspective and even more tools, to help you, or at least recommend them to pages like Mimi's, who can give them more things to look at and to think about. So yeah, it's, there's definitely a stigma that I wish would be tackled for sure.
I was thinking as you were stating too, there's that you should rely on faith, that's it. You speak to your higher power, go to church, you pray about it. And not that those things aren't true depending upon your beliefs. And, I kind of always sort of think about, but whatever your faith is and whatever your religious beliefs are, then they put those people there for a reason, like, right? Like, and so there's still this sense of they didn't create therapists not to, just talk to people. But I do think here's it maintains that stigma. It maintains the stigma of like sort of the female archetypes too, in terms of being the strong Black woman. And so then therefore, how am I supposed to have it together? How do I demonstrate, because if I'm seeking mental health treatment, am I somehow communicating a weakness? Am I somehow communicating that I don't have it all together? And so I think that not only are these external sort of social pressures, but also the internal stuff too. That then if someone were to find me out, versus, as you mentioned, Dianne, I would imagine it would kind of become like a bit of a relief, again, to see someone who looked like you across the table from you. So I even think, as you talk about going into this field, like being a therapist, is that really what I should be doing? And I think that becomes some more things, even just about socioeconomic status and what you be a doctor, not a therapist, sort of thing. So yeah.
I think another factor that comes into play is comparison to our ancestors and all that they went through. And so when we think about it and we're thinking, oh, well, they went through so much worse, how can I see how I went? They went through slavery, they went through immigration, my struggles must not be as important. And I think that can really tie into this shame around receiving care and receiving help, especially when it's receiving help from people who have had the dominant narrative in our lives, because there's so few BIPOC clinicians. And so that can play into that as well.
I really like the idea of having the opportunity of representation and seeing a therapist that looks like you, that may have a similar lived experience like Shana and I in our entryway into, either treatment or identifying our eating disorder. Because I think sometimes when we don't see a clinician that looks like us, they can't fully understand the scope of what we're going through. And in some cases, and this is just my arrogant opinion, that you're being taught just to kind of accept, tolerate, or live through the idea of the white supremacist or the white narrative of this. Let me help you just tolerate the situation that you're in, because sometimes clinicians who don't have the same lived experience or don't show up in the same identity as you can't speak to the larger issue of white supremacy and how it factors into our disordered eating, to our narrative around beauty standards, to the Black woman archetypes of the strong Black woman that we're supposed to just kind of go along and get along, and that therapists sometimes end up just teaching you how to deal with how to live in a white supremacist society, the go along, get along idea.
And are they even willing to acknowledge their level of privilege? Are they willing to acknowledge, even like you said, that's even privilege to kind of go along, get along, but acknowledging their privilege. And even for the most well-meaning people, I always think about even sort of being like a performative, ally. And so what is that really versus I'm truly like going into this and like I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to do my own homework around it so that I can be much more open to cultural diversity and learning that, because I'm just going to acknowledge that there just definitely might be areas where people of color just may not exist. And so in terms of having, maybe it's just like a smaller population of therapists or a smaller population. And so I do think if there are other people of color that reside in those communities, then hopefully some clinicians are taking the risk is what I would think about, doing what they know is really important and understanding it. That culture exists for everybody, and I'm not trying to remove this from BIPOC individuals, but maybe if they were open to that belief that even as a white individual, I have a culture too, but then hopefully that would make them a little bit more like open to, wait, let me understand and learn other people's culture as well.
100%. How does being Black affect one's ability to receive treatment and to recover from an eating disorder? Shana, I know you said that perhaps if you had had a different clinician or a different experience, it wouldn't have lasted as long. How does that affect us being able to get treatment?
Well, one, I just didn't realize what I was going through, just because the images that you see presented in the media, you just don't see yourself. So I thought you know, why on earth would I think that I was going through this experience? So that definitely is one factor. And also just speaking to somebody, you know, I think as we just talked about before, it's a little bit I don't want to use the word triggering, but it's definitely a different experience when you talk to a therapist or someone of that nature who doesn't have your experience, especially when it comes to race, even like gender or sex, whatever, you know, you want to identify with, things like that. It's very important to find someone who, you know, yes, there are allies, but it's very important to talk to someone who gets you. And I just think that if I had seen that in college, even a little bit before then, my experience, I'm not saying I don't know if it would have been totally different, but I know it would have been caught early. And I definitely would have felt like a bond with, you know, at least a therapist. I didn't even know what a dietitian was in college. So not even going to say dietitian, but definitely a therapist. If, you know, if I had seen someone that looked like me, that maybe I could share this experience with or talk about, or for someone to kind of acknowledge what I was going through as well, that would have changed everything.
Yeah. I think this is an interesting question. I was really lucky. I had a white provider who caught my eating disorder in the beginning, was intuitive eating and HAES informed, was just excellent. And so I'm really lucky and I'm grateful for that experience. But, you know, I think that's not always the case and that's not always how it happens. And I think a lot of people get missed because they don't see themselves in the movies and the images. And I remember my earliest experiences of being educated about eating disorders. I don't even know if you can call it education, but we watched movies about someone who engaged in eating disorder behaviors, you know, several times a day, and they were very emaciated, as is, you know, typical. And so when you can't see yourself in the multiple case studies and presentation and examples, then you keep wondering to yourself, well, that must not be me then, because I've never seen that before. And it's unfortunate that in our society, sometimes we have to see what we can be in other people first, instead of kind of like being able to just say, like, I can be anything, even though I don't see it. But it really helps to have that picture and that image in our minds, because other people get it. And I think that everyone deserves to be able to see role models who look like them and to see people flourishing.
Mimi, that's such a heavy comment that, you know, that unfortunately, you have to be able to find yourself or see yourself in other people before you can even sort of have permission to say that could be me, or that is me, or that's something that I'm struggling with. So yeah.
And it makes sense because we learn from other people in modeling from such a young age. We learn how to relate to other people by our caregivers. And so when we see ourselves and our narratives represented, it really decreases shame and helps us to see what we can be, what we can do, and how we were, who we came from and stuff like that. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you guys have any feelings on why it is we don't see more Black people, more people of color, more BIPOC individuals in areas of dietetics or therapy? That I was shocked when I went to that conference of 700 clinicians to see less than half a dozen people of color pursuing this. What do you think some of the barriers are that keep people out of seeking a position as a therapist or studying dietetics?
Yeah. I can speak for dietetics, but it's very it's hard to get into, one, because of the education that's needed. And when I say education, I mean money. You know, anyone can study, but it's very hard. And not to mention, after getting a degree and going through all of that, we have to do an internship, and this internship is a year long. It's unpaid, and we're basically working like 9 to 5. So there's really hardly any time to even have, like, you know, in college you would have your like side job or whatever it is. So with an internship, it's very hard to do that. And so that really leaves out a ton of people. So that's one. I think that it's just very, you know, I'm hoping that will change soon. And even now, I think it's 2024 where now a master's degree is required, which is also going to leave more people out of the field. So there's that. And also, it's just seeing, again, it's just very hard seeing someone that looks like you. When I was doing my rotations in dietetics at the hospital, I was the only Black, not even a dietitian yet. I was in my internship. And I remember the nurses being shocked to see me. They were just like, oh, I don't know what this is. They didn't know what to think of me. I was just like, yeah, here I am. So, you know, it's just, you know, that's what it is. It's like very hard sometimes to break through. And then when you do break through, you're like the only one. So it's hard. And right now, I think that as a total of Black dietitians in the US, I think it's 2.6%. Which is, I'm so embarrassed to even say that. So yeah, we need to work on it. I'll say that.
But what I wanted to say is that another factor that plays a role in being able to access master's level programs, which are required for at least therapy, for example, is that it wasn't too long ago where there was and I think sometimes it's still outward, of course, but in some ways it's become more subtle and more integrated into systems in terms of racism. And so I think outwardly speaking, people were able to say like, oh, we won't accept you into this program. Not to say that systemic racism has gone away, because it's still there and it's still rampant and it's still outward as well, which is really unfortunate. But I think, you know, in some spaces there's been some progress in terms of numbers going up of representation.
You know, I agree with both Mimi and Shana. I think that, you know, one of the things is, what's your role model, right? When you were talking earlier about what are the things that were expected, who did you see before you, how many people were going, you know, to get master's degrees, especially when the field required it. And definitely, yes, having to do internships and having to work, and where's the balance of that? So is that something that I could even do? And so, but I also think that sense of what, like I mentioned earlier, what were some of the fields that were encouraged? And I don't, can I tell you my undergrad degree is in accounting? Like, so, you know.
Those mine.
Exactly. So it's sort of like, you know, everyone is always asking the story, you're a therapist, how did you go from accounting to a therapist? And so, and it definitely was a path, but I think, I don't know that I thought about being a therapist. Even if I wanted to be in a helping field, I don't know that I would have thought it would have been a therapist like at that time. And so I do think we're the role models that are encouraging, you know, sort of this path. So I think that's one of the things. I also think even if you do become a therapist, there is still not the representation in the eating disorder world. And so, because again, I think it goes back to, who gets an eating disorder? Is that the population I want to work with? So even if I want to be a therapist and I want to be able to help people that look like me, where are those people? And so I think even in that sense, even if there are increasing, you know, Black clinicians, I wonder if they're more in, you know, you think kind of like social work, because I want to get into this field, or I want to work, you know, with this Indigenous population, or I don't know. I think that's my guess though, that no matter what, even though if you do have people who are becoming clinicians, they're still not thinking eating disorders in many ways. So, yeah.
And I'm also wondering how much racism and systemic racism within the wellness and the medical community play a role in that, right?
Oh, significant.
Right? Like we are now seeing a new administration in America, and we're hearing the words from the administration, systemic racism. We are hearing people actually name that. For me, for the first time, I've remembered somebody very at the top of, you know, the political sphere actually saying those words out loud. And I know doctors who are, you know, people of color, specifically talking about the racism within the medical community, and even, I mean, within textbooks, that kind of thing. And I wonder how much of that plays a role in who gets to be in the system, who winds up as a clinician, how are, you know, what kind of care patients are actually getting, in particular BIPOC patients.
Yeah. I was thinking because of racism in healthcare and sort of stigma, again, going back to then what was my experience. So I realized that for some, I had this awful experience. I want to make sure I'm not that kind of provider. I want to be able to be a provider that I would have wanted. And that might be the thing that motivates people to go into the field. But then also, I think with the systemic racism, then there's so much mistrust. Is that a part of the system I want to be a part of? Do I want to be in this field? So I would imagine it's definitely a barrier, in terms of people seeking healthcare, some healthcare positions, I guess I would say. But yeah, I want to be able to definitely have you all respond because I have so many thoughts about like racism in healthcare, and it really wasn't about providers as much as it was about just the experience of it all. So I don't want to like jump ahead of where maybe you're planning to go, Dianne.
Oh no, let's just get into it. Honest to God, I love talking about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I did a talk. I was preparing for a talk the other day, and I mentioned in the talk about the I can't recall his name right now, but the doctor who is sort of the godfather or the father of gynecology.
Oh yes, right. Yep.
Yeah. Kim is last name, maybe. Yeah.
Right.
And so
who shall not be named.
Yes. He must not be named. And so like that just popped into my mind, right? Where here's this experience of just being a Black person, from the very beginning, like we were an experiment, we were a body, and and it wasn't this sense of respect. And so I think talk about the birth, so to speak, of distrust in healthcare professionals. And when you start thinking about epigenetics, and even if it wasn't your personal experience, we know someone whose experience was something. In addition to epigenetics would say it could be ingrained in us already. And I just think like, we have to do better. We have to do better about racism in healthcare and really creating a space where all people, but definitely people of color feel like I can go and I can be heard and I can be heard, not listened to, but heard. That someone else, as we kind of talked about listening with the therapist's ear, like that then you're hearing me, you're hearing something beyond what I'm actually saying. And then you're taking a chance and taking a risk to ask some of the difficult questions to ensure that the person sitting in front of you is getting what they need. And I think that is the only way we're going to continuously like increase trust, for people to even seek treatment.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, just talking about that, I know who you're talking about. I don't remember his name, but instantly I was like, oh.
Yeah. None of us want to remember his name, right?
I know. I'm glad I don't, because I'm really bad at just calling people out. But like we could talk about all the experiments though. There's like Henrietta Lacks, and then like the Tuskegee, like all all of it. But just in my experience, with dietetics again, one of the issues though is also what people who are graduating, like RDs to B, as we like to call them, we notice that most people of color, especially Black people that are about to become licensed, they're sort of steered towards either food service or community outreach, which there's nothing, we need all of those things, but it's really, and I noticed that, everyone else, like pretty much like the white people that are graduating are definitely encouraged to go to hospitals and be clinicians. So you already see that divide. And like I said, all areas are important, but it really should be someone, choosing their own kind of direction, right? And not really just based on what they look like. So I find that very interesting. And that's also one of the issues of why we don't have a lot of Blacks in dietetics in hospitals or clinics, especially eating disorder facilities, because they're not really being encouraged to apply, in my opinion, and just from what I see. And also when, you know, when we get there, you know, as Paula said, it's like, are we being listened to or are we being heard? They're very different things. So I think those are very important aspects to really talk about and to dive into. Yeah.
Such a great point.
I think about it all the time. Anytime that I have to interact with the medical field, there was a meme going around on social media saying, you know, police officers are to the medical community is to Black women, police officers are to Black men. And I just thought the medical community to Black people in general, there's a huge lack of trust. And I mentioned before, I'm of West Indian parentage, Caribbean parentage. And it was always, you know, I'm from Barbados. It was always in Barbados, you go to the hospital as a last resort because, you know, you seek treatment as a last resort. You know, you work on faith, you work on prayer, you talk to your grandmother, you talk to the woman down the street, you talk to, you know what I mean? You do everything you possibly can before you can seek treatment, much to the detriment of a lot of people, right? Because things go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. And I really want to change that narrative for our people. And I think I see a lot of that in the African American community as well, like this hesitation to seek treatment because you don't think you're going to be believed, because often we're not believed. And that really needs to be addressed. That, you know, we need to listen. How can we normalize Black people in society, in a white supremacist society? How can we normalize that we have all those same experiences, and we need people to actually listen to us? And that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons why a lot of these things go undiagnosed. So as clinician, as therapists, what would you say to Black and Indigenous people of color about seeking out treatment? Like how would you call them into that?
You know, one of the things that I know this is kind of, I don't know, one of the things that we say at my job is when we have people in treatment is encouraging them to lean in, you know, just to really sort of lean into the emotional experiences, leaning into, and I kind of think about taking a risk. And so even when I think about encouraging people just to seek treatment, just sort of lean in and acknowledge, like, even if something is sort of off, I don't quite know what it is, this doesn't feel right, despite what other people say, maybe that's the first thing, like leaning into, let me figure out if something, because you don't have to commit, you can just consult, like, right? You can find somebody and just consult with them. If it's not a good fit, if you don't feel like they're asking the hard questions, what I would say is try not to stop there and try somebody else, you know, contact, you know, a resource like NIDA or a treatment facility, just asking the questions. You don't have to commit, but that's where I would say lean into it. And then even if you do pursue treatment or therapy, lean into that too. I think absolutely just knowing that it's an opportunity to feel heard and it's an opportunity to get connected to the right place, you know, even if that place isn't the initial place that I would say. But honestly, take a risk. You know, take the risk. We take so many risks in so many other ways. Take a risk on you. So, yeah.
I think I'd add it starts a lot with cultural competence and multicultural informed education in grad school. And I know they're trying to push for that in education, but it really needs to be even more. I know that I've had about half a class on that, which is just, I think it needs to just be incorporated in its own section and really take time to get to know people because there's going to be so many various experiences even within people of the same kind of racial identities. And so it's really important to look communal wise, but also individually at that person's intersections of sexual orientation and intersections of gender and stuff like that.
I think that's very important. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here because this is just my own personal question. So my mom is 79 years old and has spent her entire life on a diet. Like, I don't remember my mother not ever being on a diet. And so I was just talking to her the other day, and she's currently, trigger warning, on the keto diet. And every time I talk to her, she wants to talk to me about it. And so it's hard for me because she doesn't seem to make that correlation of 30 years with an eating disorder / disordered eating and this constant diet talk every single time I talk to her. And the thing that broke my heart the most when my mother, my 79-year-old mother, said to me, I don't know why I'm never successful at a diet. Like, I just don't know. There's something wrong with my body because it just never works. And then I went on the diatribe about the $60 billion industry and da 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 da, and that there's actually nothing wrong with her body. And I can see why she thinks that way, because we have now normalized disordered eating. Like when I hear about all these new diets, they're always deviations or variants of previous diets my mother has already been on in 1970, in 1980, every decade, there's a version of some kind of diet. So how do we switch the narrative? How do we stop touting disordered eating as like a lifestyle and wellness choice?
I mean, just the keto diet, oh my gosh. But it's so funny because that's exactly, I'm glad you brought that up, Dianne, because every new diet has already been a previous diet. It's just like reinvented, you know? And yeah, and people always think, that's why we tend to call it the diet cycle, right? Because it's not meant, you know, it's a $70 billion industry and it's not meant for anyone to stick to it, because how else would they get their money, right? So of course it's not going to work. And it's really something, because it sort of is sneaky. I like to call diet culture sneaky, because it does make people feel like something is wrong with them. And not to mention, it's completely fat phobic. It's completely, I mean, we know it's very racist as well, because it's based on these Eurocentric ideals. And of course, not everyone can look like that, nor should everyone look like that, right? So I think that the more we start embracing body diversity, you know, we talk about with our kids, you know, like, not everyone looks like you because they have different hair color, they have different skin color, they have different whatever. But we don't really get into, and you know what, they might also have a different body. No one mentions that. So it would be really good to start young. The younger, the better. And the more, you know, we talk about it openly with kids and also in the media. That's why we're pushing for this, you know, health at every size, you know, talking about weight stigma, all of that stuff. The more people will recognize it. It's just so important, and I'm not going to say it will solve all the problems, but it will definitely help, especially with something like eating disorders. When people, you know, most disordered eating tends to go into the direction of an eating disorder. So it's just something really, really important to talk about and to be open about.
I was thinking, and this is a long way around to your answer or to your question, I'm sorry. I was just thinking, you know, how as Black people, we're like always, or I think always sort of navigating two worlds, like the worlds that we exist in, and that could even be like my personal world and my work world, but world as a Black person versus the world. And so I wonder, you know, in ways like that, even somehow bringing it back to how are we constantly trying to navigate this diet world, you know, and this world of normalization and whatever that looks like. But I just wonder, like, am I still trying to fit into some others standard of what I'm supposed to be? And so again, I'm definitely not trying to minimize it, because I know it's much more than that. But I think about like this, again, trying to exist in these two worlds.
Absolutely. And I just feel at 79, like it's 79 that she's come to this real, I've never heard her say that before. Clearly there's something wrong with my body, because I've been dieting my whole life and not one of them has worked. I go, yeah, that's how capitalism works, Mom. They're just taking money. And you know, I'm
not
sure
supposed to work.
It's not supposed to work. And I'm sure when I call her again, you know, every weekend when I call her, I'm sure I'm going to have to listen to her talk about how incredibly difficult it is for her to stick to this. And my answer to her is, it's because you're not supposed to. And so I talked to her a little bit about intuitive eating and being 79 and finding the joy in nourishing your body. Like, I mean, my goodness, now would be the time to take up skydiving if that's something you wanted to do, right? I just want to say to my mom, can we set this aside? Like, can we just say, okay, I tried that for 50, 60 years or whatever, however long you've been at this, and say, okay, you know what, this isn't something that serves me anymore. And I just wish we could all get to that space. Like, we could all get to the space where we realize, this is not working, and this is just stealing the joy out of the thing. Like, can I just not? Like, I just want to hold her face and go, no, like, just no. Sweetie, have the cake, please.
You know, almost you, as you said, holding the face and made me picture like a little kid. Like, what would you say this to your little one? Like, you know, even that. Like, would you say this to your 5-year-old self, or would you say this to me at 5 years old? And you know, maybe some might, but
probably my mother would have totally said it to me at 5.
So, yeah. But yeah, just that sense. You're so right, and I like, Shana, what you stated. I think about like, you know, terms of endearment that we as people give other people, and I sometimes, she would kill me to share this and knowing that it's like lie, but like my mom would refer to my niece as like her little two-tone baby, because she was light in the face and darker than the rest of her body, or she would call her little chocolate child kind of thing. Again, loving, but yet what started to happen is she got older. I didn't want to be two-tone. I don't want to be that chocolate child. And so again, thinking about all these things that Black people are walking into treatment with, and that needs to be unpacked and addressed, you know, and it is the stuff that maintains the eating disorder. I sort of think about then all these things that Black people are bringing into treatment, and how are we addressing those things? But it was just so heartbreaking, because as she got older, and it's like high school, like wanting to bleach her skin, wanting to be the same, you know, and it's just like, no, like who you are is like so beautiful. And yet now being mindful about what we say and how we say it, because those are the things that stick. Like,
yeah, how all of that narrative and all of that culture shapes us as Black people, how we see ourselves in the world, and how we now spend the rest of our life unpacking all that stuff that has been taught to us in our formative years.
Absolutely.
As a woman who was on a diet at 8 years old, I went to Weight Watchers at 8 years old. My mother took me along. So it takes a very long time to unpack that stuff. So as we wrap, do you guys have any final thoughts? I know we kind of were all over the place, but I could talk to you guys forever. Like, once again, I'm just sitting and basking in the glow of your melanin, because I never get to see this in the therapy world, or in the, you know, eating disorder world. I never get to see this, and I want all Black folks to have this experience, right? And feel this safe, and feel this heard, and feel this seen. This is so important to me. Any final thoughts? How about we start with
you? Thank you. I'm sorry. I just, even listening to you, Dianne, I have these like warm fuzzies. Like, I have no lie. Like, thank you. And so I agree with you. Basking in this melanin, I think that is like, again, perfect. So yeah.
Well, I guess I'll just say, you know, for anyone watching, you know, I just want people to know that, not saying that like you're not normal, right? Like, because oftentimes like I said before, some of my clients are very a little bit weirded out when I tell them, you know what, maybe you did have an eating disorder. How about, you know, seeking other tools and things like that? Like, it's fine to seek help. That's what I'm trying to say. That was like a very long-winded way of saying that, but it's okay to seek help. It's okay to want more information, and there's nothing wrong with you. And also just dieting in general, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that way of thinking, just because that's what our society is telling us, but it's okay to slowly undo those thoughts. And, you know, you can do it, because the whole diet culture, I could do a whole thing about it, but it was just based on very Eurocentric ways. And it's okay to get away from that, especially people of color, especially Black people, because we're not meant to look like that. You know, and so it's okay to try to undo those thoughts, and it's okay to enjoy your cultural foods. That's a whole nother topic, but it's okay. And, you know, I just recommend people seeking help and advice and other tools.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I'll add to all of this that it's okay to kind of shift your route from maybe your parents' ideals. I think there's this belief in a lot of BIPOC people that we have to do what our parents did because they did so much for this country, they did so much for us. But I think healing is not betrayal. I think it's a beautiful thing that we're able to engage in. And that might mean, choosing to eat intuitively instead of choosing to restrict, or that might look like choosing to allow yourself to expand and take up space rather than shrinking and trying to be small and trying to kind of stay confined into certain standards and things like that.
Yeah, I would add to that, in addition, because I agree exactly what both of you are stating, it's just, maybe if you think about eating disorders are not about food, related behaviors. And so if we kind of take that step to say it's not about the food. Yes, we need to work on improving and normalizing and all of that stuff, but thinking about the stuff that then is maintaining the behavior, that's the thing that we want to be able to work on. That's the stuff that I think that I always want to be able to, how can you be the best version of you, not based on size, shape, and weight, but that you feel emotionally connected, that you are able to tolerate the stress, that you're able to, again, just lean in and experience your life. That's where I would want to be able to go. So, yeah.
I love lean in and experience your life. Don't be surprised if, oh, well, you're not on social media. I was going to be, don't be surprised. I don't make that a meme and quote you today. Like, I
So
just
I have to follow you. So clearly what you're saying is I got to get a social media and just like do it and follow each of you. So yes.
You should.
those forward-facing images on social media of people that look like us who are doing therapy, because there are a lot of people of color, especially on TikTok, a lot of people of color in the Instagram world and social media world. The way I look at social media is it's the democratization of celebrity. It gives everybody a platform, and so now I can look for people of color, and then I can read your bio, and then I can see you're a therapist, and then I can seek out counsel from you. I just think it's another tool to create forward-facing imagery that looks like us, that's created by us, that gives us the opportunity once again to bask in the glory that is our melanin, that is our ancestry, that is our history, that is our strength. And to also, every day on my Instagram page, I do a mental health wellness check-in, and I talk about the things I talk about with my therapist, because I want to normalize the fact that I have been in therapy for most of my life and I love it. Like, I just live for it. I just can't wait to sit down with my therapist. And, and I was lucky enough to find a therapist in Toronto who is Black and who's actually of Bayesian descent like me. So then we can complain about my mother or whatever we're doing, right? Like, whatever it is we're doing. So our mothers or whatever. But I think it's really, that's why I think it's important, Paula, that your face is on social media, and, and Shana and Mimi. I think it's important that we have those forward-facing images to disrupt the constant image of whiteness, or the constant image that other people are telling us we need to be. So we get to push back in a real way, and we get to incorporate some power in that way. So if anybody doesn't have anything else they want to add, I mean, we're coming up on the hour. I thought this was a wonderful conversation, and I hope people will seek each and every one of you out and understand that there's a space for us here, and that seeking treatment is strength. And just because you need help doesn't mean you're not strong, because strong people ask for help, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.